All right, welcome everyone to the recap. We've had 2.5 plus hours of hearing from some amazing projects around the world, from some great teams that came together. What our goal is for this next 30 to 45 minutes is to have an open conversation. And if we did the math right, roughly everybody saw 2 presentations and missed another 4, right? So we want to get everyone on the same page. So roughly what we want to be able to do, is in under 10 minutes, have Robin, Sam, and I just share with you a quick overview of what occurred and a highlight or two. But our goal is to get to the point where we can have an open conversation. This room should be made up of attendees and panelists. This is a space for all of us. But when we come back from our recap, I'll open up the space and invite attendees to ask any questions, share any comments, and then we'll lead from there. And from there, we'll bring panelists in as well to collaborate in the conversation. So first, why don't we introduce ourselves? I'm Barry Joseph. In New York City. As you can see behind me, I work at Barry Joseph Consulting. That's my little avatar. And I was excited to work with Robin and Sam to read all your proposals and hear what you guys all had in mind. It was really fantastic, the 2 that I went to. I look forward to sharing more about them in a moment. Robin, would you please introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Robin White Owen. I'm also in Brooklyn, New York, at Media Combo. And I attended the 2 that I attended today. I'm going to give a very quick wrap up, but I'm happy to see that there are presenters here, both Brett and I think Ksenia is here from them, so that if I miss anything important, you guys can step right in and clear up the problems.
Thanks, Robin. Sam?
Hello, I'm Saminali. I'm an electronic engineer working in the cultural heritage domain, museums and archives. I'm external expert for European Commission on topics related to museums, archives, data asset management, and artificial intelligence. So that's it.
Thank you. So let's see, the first session, which was 1:15 Eastern time. Robin, would you talk about Can't Touch This, the promise and perils of gestural interaction?
Yes, so my very quick wrap up. First of all, somebody's doing construction in the apartment next door to me, and I really hope that you don't hear that noise. It's very distracting. But basically, so when it comes to planning gestural exhibitions, there are really 5 key things that people need to take into account. And the first one is certainly audience awareness, and how familiar the people who are going to be participating might actually be with using gestures to make things happen. So the onboarding process is extremely important. And so that's the first thing I think that people really need to keep in mind. After that, it's a question of the hardware and software that you're using. And Brett and Kim gave a really good overview from the very beginning of computers and software through the Connect. And what's coming up is basically wearable sensors that people will be able to use to make gestures have actions and produce content. And the next consideration that's really important is to provide enough space for people to make their gestures so that they can actually, without hitting each other, and also without occluding each other. So that's a very important consideration when you're designing an exhibition and planning to use gestures. And the other thing that's related to that is making sure that the graphics that are next to the gesture experience are very explicit and clear when they describe what it is that you need to do, what gestures do you need to perform in order to be able to make the content appear. And then of course that leads to content. So that's the next thing that you need to think about is, how does the gesture you want people to do relate to the content that they're going to get? Because gestures have meanings, and you have to really be sensitive to that. And then that leads right up to access and inclusion, which is another very important consideration, because we're talking about physical gestures here. So not everybody can make all the same physical gestures. And so that's a really important consideration that you need to take into account when you're designing for these kinds of experiences. So that's my wrap up.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And Sam, at the same time, I believe you were at Climate Change and the Digital Experience, Developing Arctic Adventure at the Museum of Science in Boston. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Great. Tell us about what you heard there.
Yeah, the presentation was quite exciting because what they have done effectively is to realize the space of the Arctics in a museum. That is not an easy task because the Arctics are huge and you have to put them in the spaces. And they have done very incredible work on accessibility, as Robin has mentioned for the other dimension, and the creativity modeling of the activities with the users, because they have set up not only just a space, not only projections that some people would say obvious. They are not obvious also because they recreated the feeling of the space and what happens, what is the persons being in the space and feeling as if they were in the Arctics. So they recreated that space. That is not a trivial aspect for museum in particular, because it has to reproduce something that is a dimensionally diverse word, and to make it feel as if it is real or learn from it. And the creativity was really interesting also because they addressed the disability for persons that had with wheelchairs or had visibility difficulties with the devices. So they created new devices to make the feeling of these activities. And the pictures of people showed effective impact because smiling people were in the images. I suppose they were the visitors. And in general, that was impactful. And they are moving. I asked to them, are you moving it or elsewhere? They are going to do it in Venice. So that is huge and transportable. That is interesting also because museums typically are not transferred to other places as if they are a block. So, and it is not a pop-up museum. It is really an entire exhibition. So from these points of view, the challenges are really interesting.
Thank you, Sam. And before I share around it in a minute, what I was listening to, I want to remind those who are here and those who came after we started that this is going to be an open discussion. If you need your mics and cameras off, that's fine. But we want to encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to turn your cameras on. This is a space for the community to see each other and be seen. And you feel free to keep your mic on as well. Your verbal responses to what we're talking about are also welcome. And after we finish doing a real quick recap of the 6 sessions that were presented today, so we will then facilitate an open discussion in the community about the different themes that we heard and things that we're concerned about and thinking about experience design and immersive technologies. All right, so with that, my session that I went to, that was the first one, was called Learning from an Open Approach, Activating Smithsonian Open Access as a Commissioning Case Study. Now, this Activating Smithsonian Open Access, ASOA, if someone can unmute themselves, who can pronounce it for me? I know you have a name for the acronym ASOA, and I want to make sure I'm getting it right.
It's just ASOA. ASOA.
ASOA. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Phonetic.
ASOA. Not Ashoka. Ahsoka. ASOA. Okay. So ASOA is this project that was launched by Cooper Hewitt, specifically their Interaction Lab. And what they did last spring was award 7 teams $10,000 to prototype their ideas. They called it creative commissioning. And what this presentation was about seeing some of the things that were done by having outside creatives work with the Smithsonian's open database of 2D and 3D objects. But what they also were speaking about was what it meant to do it the way they did it and the power of creative commissioning. Let me see if I can pull a few things out from that. Ryan King was here, mentioned that one of the values of the process was the opportunity to mentor the grantees afterwards. He talked about how accessibility was baked into the mentoring sessions. Quote, those discussions established the baseline and common vocabulary around digital accessibility, ... And the other thing I wanted to mention was that announcements were made, and one was Ryan talking about that the new Creative Office of Digital Transformation was made at the Smithsonian, which I was excited to hear about, and that this department has been established to integrate, harness, and prioritize ongoing digital initiatives, as well as create a pan-institutional digital strategy. So we both got to hear about something happening across the Smithsonian's, and particularly within the Cooper Hewitt, and the innovative technique that they use to fund some new ideas, of which we heard about a number of them. And some of those folks are here as well. So with that, let's move to the second set of sessions. And why don't we do the same order? So Robin, I believe you went to a novel approach, literary tools and experience design. Is that right?
Yes, it is. I went and Katie Savagen, Ksenia Dinkin did a fantastic job of describing what a novel approach, what that means, right? I mean, we're all used to looking at the idea of exhibitions as stories. Basically, an exhibition is like a 3D storytelling experience, but we don't usually apply literary devices that you might find in a novel to developing exhibitions, which is the exercise that they talked about and then walked all of us through. So they decided to choose 4 literary devices: repetition, vignettes, personification, and metaphor as strategies or methodologies for designing components of exhibitions. And to give you, well, basically, to speed things up, we did a really fun exercise where we were asked, they gave us a suggestion. Suppose the MCN is doing a pop-up museum about the history of computers, and we were invited to think about a metaphor, using the literary device of a metaphor to come up with, let's see. The metaphor, the idea for it is, you choose a metaphor, you think about what visitors would feel as a result of choosing that metaphor. What would they do as a result of that metaphor? And then what are the components, the physical components that you would use to create the exhibition? So for this idea of the computer, what metaphor would, the family computer was specifically the subject of this exhibition. So the group that was there started brainstorming what the metaphor for that would be. And it was everything from like dining room table to a portal, a window, an oracle. I mean, there were 21 of us in the session, and everybody had ideas for what this should be. And it was really fun. And then, you know, we took the idea of, okay, so if it's going to be a portal or a window, how would that, what kind of emotions would that elicit from people? So people were, they'd be curious, they'd be optimistic, they would, some of them maybe be afraid. And then what would they do? So we talked about what kinds of activities they would do, and then finally what the exhibition might look like. And it was really one of the most informative and entertaining sort of group experiences that I can say I participated in. They did a wonderful job.
Thank you, Robin. And Sam, am I right that you went to expanding and enriching metadata through engagement with communities? You're muted, Sam. Please unmute.
Yeah. I worked for more than 15 years in a photographic archives in Florence, the Alinari archives. And here, what I've seen is that effectively the interest for metadata is always renewing. The topic was addressed from different point of view. From one side is addressing metadata on a traditional way, then added with user-generated annotations, and also with artificial intelligence. So these 3 dimensions are very important. Nowadays, they are effectively 3 completely different, we could say, dimensions. Also because in the scientific side is not what we might search if we are not experts. The common user don't use the same words of the experts. What was really interesting is the fact that all of this has also some kind of gender issues related to LGBT vocabulary, or to topics that are sensible from ethical point of view, of ethnicity, of cultural. So these aspects that in the past were not so much addressed efficiently, now there is the sensibility to that. One important aspect that was under discussion was also the biases that human brings it with themselves when annotating. So the session was effective, really interesting, also on addressing and training, encouraging researchers to enter in this dimension. So the aspect of metadata has addressed in the last point the aspect of refreshing metadata, because once you annotate your data in your archive, you think it is fixed there. And now the problem is that probably you need to refresh it from in different periods, because what is inside that data, it has been done in a period where some kind of bias or whatever has influenced those annotations. And these aspects are quite new on the ground, because we are moving from traditional annotations to artificially annotated or common user-generated annotations that each of them has some defects, we could say. And these aspects are quite relevant.
Sam, thank you. We've now gone through 5 of the 6. That means we're about to hit the 6th one. And after that, we'll be opening up the space. That means we'll be turning the attention away from the 3 of us to all of us together in the room. So number 6, the one that I went to is called A Journey Through Transition, but it'd be understandable if you get confused, because both of my sessions were largely about Cooper Hewitt in New York City and about APIs. But this one was different from the first one. The first one was about Cooper Hewitt having designers from outside the museum work with Smithsonian's larger API. This was about Smithsonian 10 years ago when they closed their doors because they were doing a major renovation, creating a new digital and emerging media department, which made the museum's own API. And this was about looking back at it 10 years later. And this was a very unusual API at the time. They built an API to be the infrastructure for not just visitor engagement, but also the website and gallery interactives, kind of bringing it all together. So if you're really interested in APIs, go back and watch the video. It's all about the sausage of how it was made and what they did 10 years later through a design process. It's Cooper Hewitt, they should be using a design process to understand what users need now from an API and creating tools to educate others and learn from that. Fantastic presentation, and always, of course, from the Cooper Hewitt, amazing work. So with that, I want to open up the room and also apologize for not starting with all of you, because what we should have done, we can do now. In the chat, please type in where you're located. You can define where you're located any way you want. And if you like, share something in a sentence that has either been a highlight for you from today, something you've heard that was interesting, or as a presenter, if it was useful, what was something useful for you about thinking about your work and how to present it. And so let's start with that. And so I'm going to stop talking for a moment as I just watch what people are typing in the chat. This is our space.
And also, Barry, as you suggested, people feel free to unmute and speak to us all.
People are typing while they're doing that. If you're new to Zoom, I don't know if anyone here is new for Zoom, but if you are, there's a reaction button on the bottom. It's a smiley face that says reactions. You can, at the bottom, it says raise hand, and there's a yellow raise hand. You can click that and we'll do our best, all 3 of us, to watch for anyone doing that. I'm going to click on it so you'll see what it looks like. So now a hand pops up. And in my window, it pops me to the left. So I'll see you if there's something you want to say. I'm also watching in the chat for people who have questions and things that they want to talk about. I see we have folks here from Colombia, from DC, from Toronto. Now, I see on the bottom, there's 40 people here. I've only seen 4 people respond so far. There we go. Rachel in Brooklyn. Sarah in Corning. I was just reading about Corning today.
I think it would be interesting to hear from some of you all who were at these presentations, what your, if you could share some of your reactions to what you heard. Yeah. Or some more questions. I know there were some people in both of the presentations that I was at are here.
So Robin, I see Francis wrote in the notes that they enjoyed the metadata session. Francis, are you comfortable unmuting yourself and sharing what you found useful about it?
I can do that. Just turn my camera back on. Hello. Hi. Well, I'm doing a lot of work with collections information. I'm the head of collections information management at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So interested in all things metadata, very interested in APIs too. I was at the Cooper Hewitt's, the first of the sessions today. And so thinking about how we organizationally use the API and the collections information to make it available and fit for purpose for all the purposes, not only that we can think of now, but anything we might be able to think of in the future is, I think, the exciting part of my job. Doing a lot of work at the moment around documenting artist diversity and the issues around, what museums do, what we don't do, what we capture, how we capture, what sort of language we use, how we interact with artists. And so I'm particularly interested in the conversation from the metadata session, which touched on that quite a bit. There's an initiative that the Association of Art Museum Curators is running right now that I'm a part of, and about 40 institutions are, where we're trying to come up with some best practice around that topic. And so all things metadata in that realm are particularly interesting to me at the moment.
Thank you, Francis. Is there anyone who'd like to add to what Francis was saying about metadata or have their own reflections on that before I move to someone else? Going once, going twice. You should feel free just to unmute yourself and jump in too, if you'd like. All right, next topic. Thank you. So Brett, you mentioned in the chat that we're all trying to figure out ways to be both open to and critical of gesture and quote unquote non-traditional tech interactions. I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking about there.
Sure. I think that a lot of the questions were, people had great questions around trying to get drilled down to more specific examples of successful or not successful uses of gesture. But I think there's a lot of other questions around the limitations, thinking about not only thinking about physical mobility, but can the tech reasonably detect kids and adults the same, or people with really different body types and things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting questions kind of probing against the what's possible, what's interesting, what's sort of doable. But I also saw a lot of people just kind of curious about like, hey, is this actually interesting? Could this be fun? Trying to say like, yes, there's a lot of gotchas and a lot of things that are going to be really tricky. But I also thought that people seemed like kind of curiously optimistic at the same time.
Brett, I'd heard from someone who works in the space that they had learned, to their dismay, that the Connect, I think it was the Connect, maybe it wasn't Connect, but one of the gesture control devices was not identifying people who had darker skin, so that people of color were not being recognized. Is that accurate, or is that misinformed? If you know.
I don't know about the Connect specifically. The way that it works, ostensibly, that wouldn't necessarily be the case, but I could see, a lot of it, it's a mix of, we talked about this for a second in this session too. I think that came up with the body types question. It's hard because we're sort of, this is a weird word to use, but almost like subjugating ourselves to these bigger corporate companies that are kind of doing the initial AI training that kind of informs these systems. And I think it's a word of caution too of, you have to do all this testing and actually really try it out to see whether or not these things work for your target audience. So I think it is and can be an issue, especially with cameras that are not depth specific. But I think one of the notes that we had was that there's a lot more AI and machine learning approaches that are enabling gesture interactions with non-fancy cameras, basically. But those have the same kind of issues too, that there can be biases in the way that they're trained and often are.
Thank you, Brett. Sam? You want to jump in?
The point there is particularly relevant to this question about recognition of persons, and it's linked to many aspects. One of these is the training, and this is also what has came out with the metadata. If you train an artificial intelligence with junk in, junk out, the system, it learns what you give it to learn from it. So machine learning is sensible to that aspect. But another aspect is also so the training material. And the other aspect is the developer side. So artificial intelligence, if it is developed by people with some biases, inherited some of those aspects inside the code, because you train the system with data, but also the development might be affected.
Thank you, Sam. I'm seeing Victoria also responded. about the metadata workshop, going back to the earlier topic. Before I mentioned that, is there anyone else who wants to weigh in on the topic that Brett and Sam have just been talking about around gestures and the AI and biases inherited in the system that can create increased inequalities? All right, if you want to come back to it in a bit, let me know. Victoria, can I get you on the mic? Share what you were saying in the chat by text. So
I really don't have much more to say other than the text. I am looking to connect with colleagues in the museum computer network to further that work. I'm trying to build a connection of professionals in the GTA, Toronto, Niagara, Horseshoe area. And I'm reaching out to university librarians who are also very interested in this. So that's sort of the stage that I'm at in terms of my efforts. And if there's anybody else that can link me up with people, that would be great.
And Victoria, that's a great segue to one of the questions asked earlier in the chat from Ryan, who wanted to know what are some of the best places that you go to, that all of us go to have these kind of ongoing questions and conversations throughout the year. We're all here, we've identified MCN, but what are some other places we go to? And I'm going to ask everyone in chat to type at least one place you go to keep yourself informed. How do you dip into that stream of information? How do you make sure you don't fall behind? How do you find out the latest new tech tool? How do you find out about that research to let us know about things that are working and not working? Who are the people you follow? What are the gatherings you go to connect with people? Go ahead and let's spend some time in the chat. And I'm going to include myself there as well. If there's any individuals that you find inspiring, you follow them on Twitter, you read them on Medium, wherever it might be, it'd be great to hear some of those names too as well. We're seeing some great organizations, some newsletters, social media, little SIGs, hashtags to follow. So while people are thinking about things they might want to share, Victoria was using this space to ask for advice, right? Which was great. That's a great way to use our time here. Is there anyone else who has a question that you'd want to ask to this group? That's advice for yourself, things you want to know for yourself, things that this group might be able to help you with today. If you do, and you're feeling shy, you can hit the hand and I'll call on you. You can type it in the chat, but I know we all have questions. We all need help. That's why we come to events like this. We want to learn. Great links coming in, great resources for all of us to use. I see in the chat. Good. Robin and Sam, of course, feel free to come to ask questions as well. But the question I might ask next, I'm again just looking for questions that might engage us all, is what's the number one thing that keeps you up at night about our space when we're thinking about specifically the area of experience design and immersive technologies with museums? What concerns you the most?
Robin, you are the first.
That's them.
I'm just reading a lot of the things that are in here. I actually had a question for Lindsay that doesn't have anything to do with any of what we're momentarily just talking about. So I won't I won't derail the conversation right now.
Well, so Rob, let's give it a moment or two for my question about what's keeping people up at night. And if there's no takers, then I'll go back to you. I'm glad to hear we're all sleeping well, because it's been a really stressful year and a half.
Oh.
That's good. But if
Is
no one
Jessica on
had
this? I don't know.
any other last chance for the moment of pressing concerns? Oh, here we go. Peter says, sustainability of the stuff we've all made, exclamation mark. And Max writes, the brain drain from job loss of those experienced in museum tech and learning during the pandemic. I feel that one as well. And then Ryan mentions, hate to use a buzzword, but relevance, but only as a bridge to really and authentically understanding and connecting with our audience. And I assume what we're saying here is the potential loss of relevance. Is that what you're saying, Ryan? Or how to maintain that relevance?
Yeah, more or less, or building new relevance, or having others, and like, yeah, just connecting with and having those conversations and discourse more broadly. I think oftentimes we are still very siloed, or I just know from our own perspective, a lot of what we do produce is still very inward focused. It's like reflective of like the departments that it's derived from, but not from like audience perspective. And even some of the jargon and language we use, it's a bit varied and all over the place. So I think just being more realistic about, if that really is the goal, if we are meaningfully want to have an impact in that way, how can we, I think, address a culture shift in that, but be, really let our end users guide us in how we address those concerns.
I like the phrase, let the end users guide us. Anyone want to add to or reflect on what Ryan is sharing about relevance and making sure we're connected with our end users? Cyprian saying, make tech serve the inclusion and accessibility. Maybe it's related to that. I want to reflect on what Max was saying about the brain drain from job loss. Max was talking about specifically during the pandemic, but I have some of you know I have a book coming out next year. I'll put the link in. It's about digital design in museums, but mostly it's about 6 years, 2012 to 2018. And when I finished writing it, it was both shocking and upsetting to go back and look at all of the work I was talking about, not specifically at my museum, American Museum of Natural History, but the work I was writing about museums around the country and around the world. Almost every single person who was doing innovative work that I wrote about during that time with AR, robotics, design practices with young people, not only are they not at the museum they worked at the time, they're not even in the museum space anymore. So I agree. I hear about the pandemic really having devastated our space, and thinking about what it means for us to recover gives me stress. But this is not a new challenge for us in our space. People thinking about digital engagement and digital design, digital learning. This has been a challenge for years. There was this rise in interest, and all these positions were created. And many of the top people I was writing about in the book, not only are they no longer where they were working, their positions just don't exist anymore. They weren't replaced with someone else. So that's of great concern to me about what it means for the future of our space to be prepared for what's going to happen. Oh, Francis, can you please say more about that? Francis wrote, the gap between digital migrant museum leadership and digital native audiences. Please.
Hi. Well, I think depending on where you are and what your leadership is in your individual institution, you've got more or less support for doing some pretty innovative work with your audiences. And I think my museum currently finds itself in a situation where we don't have a media and technology division anymore. It was just reorganized out of the organization. Our chief digital officer left to take another job and has not been replaced. So we don't have anybody at the leadership level who is digitally focused or has a clear vision, let's say, of the way forward. So it's a concerning time. And the question, I think, for us, it's part of a really major museum reorganization with a fairly new director here. And so we were very well placed based on the previous people in post and all the work we'd done around digital content. When the pandemic hit, we did great. We transitioned online immediately. We'd already had a lot of content out there. But as we go forward, if that gap persists, what happens to our digital projects, digital initiatives? How do we, that question of relevance, how do we remain relevant if we're not being proactive and only find ourselves in a situation where we have to be reactive? And I think that can come more quickly than people think. So I think
what can come more quickly? Which part exactly?
I think the finding yourself in a position where you're sort of flat-footed and you've got to react really quickly because you hadn't realized how far you'd lost your relevance, I guess, is how disconnected you might have become from an audience that has very high expectations these days of the digital. So I think not all of the leadership and all of the museums, certainly in the United States, are very plugged into the digital side. They need some people to guide and help bring them along to see the vision of what's possible. I think the Museum Computer Network, the MCN group, is fabulous at that, but if they are not in position, then can lead to problems down the line. That's all.
Thank you, Frances. While you were sharing, people were reflecting on what you were saying in the chat in a number of different ways. Some talking about maybe people spend less time at museums now, and what are the implications for that? And also at the same time, this piece around audience-focused competencies are not necessarily there in staff, and what happens when we transition. And in fact, Rachel had the last voice on it, saying, I find that audience-focused / design practices seem siloed in quote unquote digital in museums in a super problematic way. Rachel, I'd love to hear you talk about what ways it's super problematic. Why does that concern you?
Sure. Well, I would like to build on a point that Ryan made earlier, which is about relevance. And to be clear, I'm not sure that museums have been relevant to audiences ever. I mean, I think there are people in museums who are trying to really change that, but I think the idea of being audience-centered, which seems to make its way into museums through user experience and digital practices, but then remains siloed in those practices often because the distinctions between various parts and functions of the museum don't actually adopt a user-centered approach. So I think, it's something that I run into a lot. And I mean, being at a design museum, but also, thinking, I'm more of a strategist than a designer per se, but I think thinking more in a designer's head around how to ask questions, how to ask design-driven questions, how to set objectives, and how to actually go about defining a space of possibility. It just doesn't seem like in the exposure to museums that I've had thus far, which granted is not a ton, but I've spent a lot of time talking to colleagues at Cooper Hewitt and elsewhere. It just doesn't seem like that kind of thinking is really that pervasive. So yeah, I mean, Lindsay, I would love to, Lindsay, I don't know if you feel like responding or thinking about that, but Lindsay Green sort of made the comment to start this corner of the conversation. And I feel like you always have really smart things to say. So not to call you out, but if you feel like saying a thing.
Lindsay, we'll give you a few moments to decide. Oh, here we go. Yay.
Sorry, Lindsay.
You're muted, Lindsay. Lindsay, you're muted.
Lindsay, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. No, I think what I'm seeing is the language of audience-centeredness, and the idea of audience-centeredness is really, really attractive. I think there is a difference between making a physical space that, a lot of museums are designed to be exhibition sausage factories where you do have this kind of waterfall process, and audience-centeredness kind of coming into that, it feels very problematic. I think we've been doing quite a lot of work on strategy, trying to bring in those practices into organizations, and actually it's really difficult to find case studies that are very museum centered. You can find them around other industries, but actually finding them in museums. So if anybody has them, that's great. I know that the Exploratorium, for example, and quite a few science museums kind of come with a more audience-centered starting point, but quite often the questions that activity is trying to answer is very much a museum-centered question from the start, I think probably is one of the challenges, where I see a lot of digital practice now is moving more to starting with an audience-centered question from the start.
Thank you, Lindsay. We just have a minute or two left. Anyone else want to weigh in? Any voices we haven't heard yet around an audience-centered museum and keeping the professionals who are thinking about digital futures employed in our cultural institutions, to keep them relevant and healthy and sane?
You know, I think there are a lot of museums, a lot of virtual museums that are cropping up, and also places like Meow Wolf that at one point, or the Van Gogh experiences that, well, when I first heard about Meow Wolf, they were claiming that they were a museum, and you know, the whole in other words, the whole definition of what is a museum and what is the purpose of the museum, and what audiences do they serve and why, you know, it's really it's become a much more multifaceted discussion, I think, than it used to be.
For better and for worse. The
Definitely.
conversation should always go on. We should always be questioning and challenging and unpacking and repacking. What does it mean to be a museum? And maybe with that, we should end our time together. Before we break, this is a community here. Does anyone want to make any announcements? First, about things that are happening at MCN you want us to know about, or anything else related to the topic at hand? I have an announcement, but I'll do it last. I'll give the floor first to anyone else. All right, so on Tuesday, we'll be having our Kahoot trivia competition. I hope you'll consider checking it out. It should be a lot of fun. The other thing I wanted to mention was, no, we don't have time. I'm going to leave off the last joke. Sorry about that. Let me know if you want to get it by texting it to me. Contact me. Otherwise, thank you so much for participating in these last few hours together, especially all the presenters who put all the work together to share their work, and all attendees who came and asked all the really great questions throughout the sessions, and more importantly, MCN for bringing us all together. Thanks everyone so much. And we hope to see you at the future MCN sessions over the next few weeks.